Greedy stepfather stole my entire college fund for his 15th wedding, so I exposed him. Greedy stepfather stole my entire college fund for his 15th wedding, so I exposed him and got him arrested. I lost my grandfather when I was 21. He was a strong and pragmatic man who ran his own bakery for over 40 years and raised 3 children. My dad, being the middle child, often had conflicts with him. As a child, I frequently witnessed my grandfather and my dad bickering over minor issues, and I wondered why until I understood that my grandfather disliked my dad because of me. For context, according to my aunt, my parents never really wanted me. They harbored resentment towards me from the moment I was born. For the first 8 months of my life, I lived with my aunt and my grandfather. However, as I grew older, my grandfather forced my parents to take responsibility. As a child, I was often called various derogatory names by my parents, especially my mother, who labeled me idiot or dumb for the smallest mistakes, which was incredibly hurtful to hear. Interestingly, despite these labels, I became the most academically accomplished among my cousins. Thanks to my parents' DJTM encouragement, I developed a strong interest in pursuing a degree in engineering. My parents would punish me for seemingly minor reasons, such as wearing nail polish or talking to a boy. My mother never allowed me to wear makeup and disapproved of my tight clothing, even if it was just leggings and a long shirt. Her controlling nature significantly impacted me as I was growing up. When my parents argued, it always seemed to be my fault somehow. Additionally, my dad constantly complained that I didn't help around the house. The reality was that I'd been taught from an early age to assist with household chores. I folded at least 3 loads of laundry daily, cleaned one of the bathrooms each day, washed the dishes, and took care of various other tasks like sweeping the floors. Despite all this, I never complained, but my parents never appreciated it. It felt like I was an unappreciated maid in their home. Back then, I did most of the things my parents told me to do and avoided anything they didn't mention. I refrained from drinking, stayed away from drugs, and made sure not to wear what they deemed inappropriate clothes. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to go out with friends, even for birthdays, and having them over was also off limits. There were times when I came up with excuses to stay later at the library because I enjoyed spending time with others outside the confines of my home. However, everything changed when my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Despite my resentment towards my mother for always trying to control my life, I didn't want her to die. But my dad clearly felt differently. He left my mom saying he did not want to be stuck with a sick spouse. My mother and I were stunned as we watched him pack his bags and leave. Later, my mother broke down while sitting on the balcony. Even though I was just 16 years old, I could understand her pain. I had always seen her sit and drink a beer on the balcony whenever she had a bad day, so when I heard her crying, I got her a beer from the fridge. My mother started bawling when she saw me handing her the beer and understood that I was trying to comfort her in the only way I knew. From that day on, everything changed between my mother and me. She was no longer rude or abusive towards me. I can even say that she became a good mother after my dad left. In the following weeks, my parents got divorced, which was straightforward since my mother had a prenuptial agreement, and he couldn't take anything. By next month, my dad had already moved in with his new girlfriend, who was apparently his high school sweetheart, Melissa. During this time, my dad hated having me for the weekends. Whenever my mom would drive me to drop me off, he would make up some excuses about why he couldn't see me that weekend. It really hurt me because it felt like my dad had divorced me along with my mom. Throughout all this, my grandfather continued to visit me, and I loved spending time with him. He would call me and all my cousins once a month to have a sleepover at his house, which is still one of my favorite memories to date. 5 months after my parents' divorce, of course, my dad got married again. His high school sweetheart, Melissa, bought a house for my dad in hopes that they could grow their family together. However, my dad had other plans. Whenever I would get to visit him, which was rare, I would always find my dad on his phone, giggling and talking to someone without a care in the world. He would only cut off the call once it was time for Melissa to come back home. Apparently, Melissa eventually found out that he had been cheating with another woman, and they had a huge fight. However, My father managed to convince her that it was just a one-time mistake, so they stayed together. During this time, my mom's health was not improving from her cancer. In her last days, she would spend as much time with me as she could. I would come back home from school terrified, thinking something might have happened to her. Unfortunately, one night my mom passed away in her sleep after months of chemo not working. My grandfather and my mom's family were the first ones to reach me as I just could not stop crying. When my dad came over, he was alone, and there was no Melissa in sight. I did not know this then, but my dad had continued to talk to the other woman behind Melissa's back, and she had finally left. Throughout my mom's funeral, my dad kept saying how my mom's death couldn't have come at a worse time since he was already dealing with a lot. Everyone was so shocked and irritated by his callousness. When my mom's will was read, it was declared that all her assets would be going to me. Immediately, my father seemed very interested in being back in my life. However, my grandfather did not want me living with my father since he knew the kind of man he had become. He knew my dad wanted me for the money my mom had left behind for me. He and my aunt helped me sell all my mom's assets so they could open a college trust fund in my name. However, because I was still a minor, my dad's name also had to be added. Meanwhile, Melissa, my dad's wife, divorced him during this period. Since they had no prenup, she ended up with a substantial settlement. My grandfather warned my dad not to dip into my funds, emphasizing that he already had his own money. My dad agreed to this arrangement. When Dad and I started living together, it felt at first like I was living with a stranger. He had changed so much over the years and not in a good way at all. All he ever did was behave like a teenager himself. He would get dressed up and go out every night. He would come back home late at night with strange women and take them into his bedroom. Every morning, I would walk into the kitchen and notice someone different. It became a daily routine. When I turned 16, my dad introduced me to his third wife, Lisa. Right from the start, it was clear she didn't like me. Her behavior towards me was mean and unnecessarily critical. Whenever I raised the issue with my dad, he confronted her, leading to even more covert and behind-the-back hostility. Then, when my brother arrived 10 months later, my dad's narrative shifted to paint Lisa as a good person deep down, and that apparently, I was encouraged not to resent him, but to be more understanding. However, Mike had no issues showering love on my baby brother Brad. Oddly, my mom confided in me several times that she had nothing in common with Mike, but she had married him because he would provide us with a stable family. This was far from the truth, because my mom and Mike would have nasty fights, especially after Brad was born. Mike did not want my mother to spend any time with me and would yell at her if she was not anywhere near Brad. He would tell me things like how he wished I would have died with my dad or that I lived with my grandpa because he wanted his son to get all the love and attention. It was hurtful and mentally exhausting to live with him where I was clearly not wanted. Whenever I asked my mother why she stayed with him, she would deftly change the topic. One evening, my mother and Mike left us with my grandpa so they could go out with their friends and have a good time. What started as a monthly occurrence had turned into an almost every weekend routine. They would usually ask me to look after Brad while they were out, but that night I had to study for an important exam, so they dropped us off at Grandpa's house. I loved being there, and he would cook delicious meals for me, giving me the peace I needed to study. Brad played contentedly with his toys on the living room floor. My grandpa had strictly told my parents to return by 9 o'clock to pick us up. However, even after 9 p.m., they were nowhere to be found. I grew anxious because of my upcoming exams and the need to get Brad to bed on time to avoid Mikev GRTM's wrath. My grandpa kept calling them and left 3 furious messages. Finally, at 1 a.m., Mike and my mom stumbled in, completely drunk and laughing like school kids. They smelled strongly of alcohol, and we were surprised they made it home without being stopped. Mike went to pick up Brad while my mother told me to gather my belongings so we could leave. My grandpa, however, put his foot down. He scolded them for arriving so late and being so intoxicated, which was dangerous for all of us. He told Mike that he couldn't take Brad in that condition and suggested calling a taxi to take us home, leaving the car behind. Mike, however, began to argue with my grandpa, insisting that he was the father and knew what was best for his child. The argument quickly escalated, with both of them shouting insults. My mom stood by, saying nothing, too drunk to intervene. The tension was palpable, and I begged them to stop, reminding them they were scaring Brad. But they ignored me. The shouting continued, and Mike hurled insults at my grandpa and me, claiming he never liked us but tolerated us for my mother VJTM's sake. This infuriated my grandpa even more, and in a fit of rage he threatened to call the police. Enraged and drunk, Mike did the unthinkable. He slapped my grandpa. I screamed in terror as Mike's hand hit my grandpa's face, the sound echoing in the room. "Stop it! Just stop!" I yelled, but Mike didn't even look at me as Brad began to cry, clearly frightened. My grandpa, clutching his cheek, ordered me to call the police while my mother watched in stunned silence. I barely remember what I told the 911 operator because I was crying so much. Thankfully, the dispatcher understood and stayed on the line with me until the police arrived. Sirens pierced the air, and panic crossed McKevTM's face. Suddenly, he started to beg my grandpa, desperation in his eyes, pleading with him not to press charges, insisting it would ruin his life, and my mom's. In the end, Mike was charged with assault and taken away in handcuffs. He kept pleading with my mom to help bail him out, but my mom, who had stood frozen earlier, started to cry and yell at him. My grandpa made it clear to my mom that if she did not divorce Mike, he would involve CPS, and she would lose both her children. My mother simply nodded, clearly looking terrified. It was only later that I found out that Mike and my mom had also tried drugs that night along with alcohol. The reason she escaped arrest that night was because she was mostly silent, unlike Mike. That night, Brad and I stayed at my grandpa's place because I refused to be with her alone, as I was so disappointed and traumatized. Thankfully, the next day when my mother came to her senses, she realized just what her husband had done. She filed for divorce and forbade him from ever seeing us. When the rest of the family found out about what Mike had done, they all came down on my mom, and rightfully so. Everyone had questions. Why did it take so long for my mom to take action? Why didn't she see the signs earlier? My aunt and uncle yelled at my mom until she started to cry. They were so angry that they vowed to never speak to her again for what her husband had done. As for Mike's charges, since he was a first-time offender, the court imposed probation. During this period, Mike had to attend counseling and was ordered to stay away from us. He could only see his son if my mother allowed, and she was present as well. He tried to beg my mother for forgiveness, but she didn't listen and divorced him. She got a lot from him in the settlement and has since been living a good life. I did not want to stay with my mom after the Mike incident, so I moved all my things to my grandpa's place while Brad stayed with my mom. My mom didn't like this arrangement one bit since she depended on me to babysit my brother, but she couldn't can't say anything to me for fear that my grandpa would chew her out. This year, I celebrated my 19th birthday. I was so excited to finally be an adult and start a new phase of my life. However, life had other plans for me. My grandpa passed away just a week after my birthday. He had a heart attack, and it was completely unexpected since he did not have any heart problems. After his funeral, the whole family learned that he had drawn up a will to divide his assets among my mom and aunt. He had equally divided up his family heirlooms and jewelry, which were quite valuable. For his oldest son, my uncle, he left his car, which he had always loved. For my cousins, he divided his money into college trust funds. For me, he left his house, apparently because I was the closest to him and had been living with him. He did not want me to go back home to my mom ever again. I was shocked and started to cry tears of joy as his house meant a lot of happy memories for me. Unfortunately, my grandpa didn't leave Brad anything. I don't know if he simply forgot, or maybe it was because Brad was just my half-brother. Needless to say, my mom was livid with my grandpa's decision. She flat out said that giving me a house was worth so much more than her jewelry, and it simply wasn't fair for her father to leave me so much. No one else except my mother had any complaints since they all understood that my grandpa had left us things we all deserved. My mother then got angry lavish wedding and how I was expected to attend. This news was the last straw. I was furious and decided I had to do something about it. I confronted my mom about Brad not getting anything and started to badmouth my grandpa, calling him selfish for not considering her son. This infuriated me, and I told her she should be grateful that her father decided to leave her anything at all after what her ex-husband did to her. Hearing this, my mother became angry, saying I had no right to bring up the past, which made me scoff at her. Then she started to tell me how I should sell Grandpa's place and move in with her. I told her that I genuinely loved staying at the house and would never sell it, since it meant more to me than money. My mother tried to urge me more, but I stood my ground. Living on my own has been wonderful. I had always been surrounded by toxic people until I moved to my grandpa's place permanently, and I had never lived alone before. However, I've been spending a lot of time with myself and going to therapy to deal with my grandpa's death. With everything going on in my life, I decided to take a gap year. Because I was no longer a minor, I wanted to remove my mother from my trust fund. I needed her signature to access the funds, and also to remove her from the beneficiaries. So I went to talk to my mother 2 months ago. She introduced me to her new boyfriend, Robin, who she had been seeing for weeks. Robin seemed like a pleasant guy, quite younger than her, unlike all her previous ex-husbands. However, I knew better than to bring up his age, so I asked my mom to talk privately, and she agreed. I expected things to go smoothly with her regarding my trust fund, since this was rightfully the money that my dad had left for me. However, my mother started to freak out when she heard that I wanted to remove her from the trust. I found this odd and told her how this was always the plan anyway, and now that I am 19, I would like to handle my own finances. She refused and told me that I was still young, and because I was not going to college this year, I didn't VJTM'd need to remove her. Her behavior was starting to make me suspicious, but my mother kept insisting that I could always come to her when I started college later. I spent some time with Brad and then left. It was only when I was driving back home that I realized there was a chance my mother could have been using my money from the funds. Even though it seemed far-fetched at the time, I decided to consult a lawyer who could help me figure out the terms and conditions of the trust document. The lawyer reviewed it and agreed that my mother needed to sign off for me to access the funds. However, I could view its current value if needed. This is how I found out from the bank what my mother had been doing. Not only had my mother been withdrawing money from the trust fund in small amounts over the years, but after our recent conversation, she had completely wiped the account clean. I was horrified. It felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath me. The betrayal hit hard, leaving me grappling with a sense of disbelief and anger. For days I was crying and moping around the house, unable to understand why my mother would do something like this. No wonder she did not want me to remove her from having access to my funds. I knew if I confronted her about it, she would just deny it or come up with a lame excuse. I felt like I needed to teach her a lesson. Just as luck would have it, my mom, oblivious that I knew about her betrayal, called to let me know that she was getting married yet again. She was excitedly talking about how Robin was definitely the one, which almost made me roll my eyes, as this was the same thing I had heard from her with every guy. Believe what I was hearing. I had expected a reaction, but the sheer audacity of my mother's defense was infuriating. My mother continued to argue, saying she had every right to the money because she was my mother, and I should be grateful for everything she had done for me. Robin, looking utterly betrayed, demanded to know the truth. The room was filled with tense silence, broken only by whispers and gasps from the guests. My mother, now realizing she was cornered, started to cry and yell at me, calling me ungrateful and childish. She claimed she hadn't stolen anything, insisting she had a right to the money because she had been married to my father and had raised me. I yelled back at her, pointing out that what she had done was illegal and that I was going to make sure she faced the consequences. My mother scoffed, telling me I was making a big deal out of nothing and that I should let her have the money as repayment for raising me. Robin, visibly shaken, asked if this was why they could afford such a grand wedding, and my mother's silence was all the confirmation he needed. The tension in the room was palpable. Robin's family looked shocked and disgusted, while my relatives nodded in support of my actions. The guests were murmuring, and the atmosphere was thick with disbelief. My mother, now desperate, tried to regain control by lashing out at me, but it was too late. In a final act of defiance, I held up the documents proving her theft and declared that I was pressing charges. The room erupted in chaos as my mother tried to defend herself, but it was clear that her lies had been exposed. The police were called, and as they arrived, my mother was taken away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence. Robin, heartbroken and humiliated, apologized to me and my family. He had been unaware of my mother's deceit and was devastated by the betrayal. My relatives rallied around me, offering their support and ensuring I was okay. I couldn't contain my anger and began yelling at her. The chaos escalated as my relatives joined in, expressing their outrage at my mom's despicable actions. Amidst the shouting, my mom retaliated, insisting it was a private matter between me and her and that they should not judge her for it. Things got physical when my aunt got too close while confronting her, leading to shoving between them. The chaos reached its peak, prompting someone to call the police. Eventually, my mom was arrested since she kept shouting and yelling when the police arrived and refused to settle down. I went to the police station with my aunt to give my statement. Since then, my mother has been charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. I can't believe this even as I'm writing it because I never thought I would get my mother arrested. I can't believe she would do such a thing to me. Since her wedding, I've been receiving calls from everyone, both out of concern and also indignation. Some of my distant relatives think that I took things too far and that I should have never involved others in this matter or gotten my mom arrested. My side of the family believes that I did the right thing. However, this is such an extraordinary circumstance that I am forced to ask if I did go too far with my mom. Update 1. Thank you everyone for your kind words. When I posted this, I was overthinking, and I felt really guilty since I have never really hated my mom, or at least I didn't until she pulled this stunt. I never wanted to file a case against her, and it still feels like I'm having a bad dream. However, I do understand that these are the consequences of her own actions. To everyone who is worried about me, please don't worry because my uncle has helped me find a good lawyer who is confident that we will win this legal suit against my mom. My only goal is to recover my lost money, or at least as much as I can. Also, for anyone wondering about Brad, he is doing okay. He's still too young to understand what is happening. He's currently staying with Joe and his family since my mom's arrest. Update 2. It's been 6 months since my last update. I know a lot of you have been wondering about what happened, and I would like to clarify that I was not allowed to talk or write anything about the case since the legal proceedings were ongoing. In short, the court ruled in favor of me. My mother has been ordered to pay back every penny of the money she had stolen from me. She cried and begged, but the judge didn't budge. She now has to liquidate all her assets and probably also sell her house in order to pay me. It feels so good to write this, since these last few months have been brutal on my mental health. The only thing that has kept me going is thinking of my grandpa and dad. My grandpa would have been proud that I stood up to my mom, and my dad would have wanted me to have his money so I could invest in my future. Update 3. It's been 3 months since I last updated here. How was everyone's new year? Mine was fantastic. My mother, facing the weight of her actions, has repaid the entire amount she had embezzled from my college trust fund. The legal proceedings compelled her to make amends, at least financially. I also made the difficult decision to sever ties with my mother permanently. The rest of my family echoed this sentiment, and we collectively decided to distance ourselves from her despite her trying to reach out to us, as if she expected us to just forgive and forget this incident. Lately, I have been checking out brochures and thinking about what's next in 2024. The gap year has turned out to be amazing overall. Despite the legal proceedings, it has been a mix of figuring myself out and healing from past trauma. Spending time with my cousins and other family members has been a big part of moving forward.